If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. I also finally have a Twitter account, so hit that follow button. When it comes to demographics, Germany certainly is one of the most interesting nations in the Western world. Over the course of 1 century, Germany went from being a demographically highly dynamic young empire through a phase of genocidal demographically fueled ideology based on radical concepts of racial purity, to being one of the pioneers of low fertility and aging society, to finally arriving at a point of rather dramatic mitigation of the impacts of aging and population decline by truly massive immigration, inevitably leading to a large-scale and fast-paced ethnic change with yet unforeseen consequences for the German and thus also European society and history. One can see that Germans tend to act and think in extremes. I was especially looking forward to this video, since I would argue that German demographics are a topic of national importance. I'm Czech. Now, one of the very elemental things a young Czech pupil learns in an elementary school history class is the tale of 2 brothers, Václav and Boleslav. They were Czech nobles back in the 10th century, and they disagreed about their approach towards the Saxon and Bavarian dukes on their western border. Václav decided to pay a yearly tribute to the Germans to keep the peace, while Boleslav wanted to be sovereign, even if it would mean a conflict with the Germans. Václav was then murdered, and the most well-known interpretation of his murder is that he was murdered by Boleslav or his cronies for maintaining a subservient position before the Germans. Modern historians do not entirely agree on this interpretation, but it is the most firmly embedded one in the minds of Czechs. Whatever the precise circumstances of Václav's murder, the fact that the brothers held opposite views on the approach towards Germany is likely true. It shows that from the earliest beginnings of the history of Czech statehood, the question of our relation to Germans on our western border was usually the most fundamental challenge that various incarnations of the Czech state faced, and it never really changed. Holy Roman Empire, Austrian Empire, Third Reich, and now the European Union. Now, I am by no means comparing the Third Reich to the European Union in a political way. That is obviously nonsensical. I am just pointing out that whatever Germany is doing at the moment, Czechs are usually relatively closely connected or influenced, both in good and in very bad ways. The only time that wasn't the case was when the Iron Curtain separated us. It is just a fact of our geography. When you look at the map of Germany, you can see the Czech Republic being sort of wedged into Germany. Why am I talking about this? To showcase that what happens in Germany is important to us. It influences us in genuine ways. It always has and always will, as long as there is Germany and Czechia. If Germany has issues with population aging that have detrimental impacts on its economy, it will also hurt our economy. If there is a massive ethnic change happening in Germany, it will, sooner or later, somehow influence our relations. That is just the way it is. But it should matter to all of Europe. Germany has been the most important European country in the 20th century. For a significant part of the century, Germany had the largest economy in Europe, temporarily losing it only after defeats in 2 world wars and then regaining it again. From the late 1980s on, and especially after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany, Germany's position as the largest European economy has been unthreatened. Since its unification in 1871, Germany has been Europe's second most populous country, second only to Russia. The history of Europe in the 20th century had Germany at its center, and the demographics often played a highly significant role in this history. At first, this video was supposed to be just a classic demographic deep dive, but it partially turned into an essay on Germany in general, since there were just too many things I felt I needed to say. But do not worry, the demographics are there. So, without further ado, let's get to it. One of the fascinating aspects of German history and the impacts of ancient history on contemporary times in general is the existence of the ancient frontier of the Elbe River. In the times of the Roman Empire, the Rhine River for centuries constituted the northwestern frontier of the Roman Empire, dividing it from the territories inhabited by unsubdued Germanic tribes. But for a relatively short period of 16 years, between 7 BC and 9 AD, a province of Germania Antiqua existed between the Rhine and Elbe rivers, until the Romans were pushed out again by the Germanic people in the famous Battle of Teutoburg Forest. However, even though the region between the Rhine and Elbe rivers was part of the Roman Empire only for a relatively brief period of time, it gradually became very much influenced by the Roman civilization that was often brought to them by their Germanic peers living in the Roman Empire. This influence became a permanent feature of people living in these lands. As the historian James Hawes argues in the amazing book The Shortest History of Germany, the Elbe River on the eastern edge of the short-lived Germania Antiqua became essentially the frontier between what most people have perceived as the civilized, enlightened Western Europe and the barbaric East. The difference between the two continues to massively influence German history to this day. While the parts of contemporary Germany to the west of Elbe became integral parts of Western European political structures, being core parts of the Carolingian Empire and Holy Roman Empire, the lands to the east of Elbe became the Germania Slavica ethnic borderland, where the constant and often violent back and forth between the Germanic peoples and the Slavic and Baltic tribes created an atmosphere of heightened ethnic conflict, fueled by the threat of the other coming for you. There is an interesting interpretation of how the words for Slavs and Germans in most Slavic languages, especially those that lie on the borderlands between the Slavic and Germanic worlds, came to be. Slavs call themselves Slované, which likely derives from the word slovo, which means word. When you met someone and you could understand his words, or slova, he was Slovan. On the contrary, the word for Germans is Němci, possibly deriving from the word Němí, which means mute. So, when a gang of ancient Slavs was squatting in the forest, and suddenly a group of weird blonde-haired dudes arrived on their wagons, and the Slavs could not understand a word of that unpleasant hard gibberish coming from their mouths, well, they were Němci. Then they probably either fought to death, or the Slavs bought the old wagons from the Germans for a discounted price, and maybe some Adidas tunics. It is thus no coincidence that Prussia, the German state that ascended from this environment, was a very different beast compared to the many states and principalities in the west of Germany. Western Germany, represented by the Rhine industrial heartlands and cities like Frankfurt or Cologne, was cosmopolitan, rich, and westward looking, connected to France, the Netherlands, or Britain. Prussia, on the other hand, was rural, militaristic, authoritarian, and eastward-looking. The old German dreams of Drang nach Osten, so conquering the Eastern European fertile flatlands and either subjugating or exterminating their inhabitants, was not something that people in Cologne or Frankfurt dreamed of. For them, those were some distant eastern shitholes. One of the tragedies of modern European history is that the productive, rich, and industrial Western German heartlands were united under the political leadership of the Prussian Hohenzollerns and their agrarian, militaristic Junker elite. It was one of the pieces of the mosaic leading Europe towards unprecedented civilizational catastrophe in the form of two world wars, in which Germany fought unwinnable two-front battles, a fact given both by its geography and also by the schizophrenic nature of the German East-West dichotomy. When you examine where the Nazi Party had the strongest electoral gains, it was in the eastern Prussian lands, most of which are in contemporary Poland. After World War II, the division of Germany into West and East Germany also roughly corresponded with this ancient Elbe River frontier. And when you examine the very different voting patterns of people in ex-West Germany and ex-East Germany today, the pattern still holds up. Most people just prescribe this division to communism, but that is hugely reductive. East Germany was, to a large extent, the last remnant of Prussia. One of the fascinating stories of history is that at first, Prussia dominated West Germany, and then, after two lost world wars and 40 years of communism, Western Germany, now much more populous, prosperous, and strong, swallowed the last remnants of Prussia. It was nevertheless part of a process in which Germany again stopped being simply another Western European country and started regaining its influence in the European East. After the fall of communism and the integration of the post-communist states into the EU, Germany managed to integrate most of the countries into its trade sphere of influence, which was very profitable for the German economy and made Germany indisputably the center of gravity longevity of the contemporary European economy, with vast supply chain encompassing the post-communist Europe. Now, I already mentioned that Germans tend to act in extremes. Germans possess a potent ability for abstract and conceptual thinking, manifesting in the great philosophical works of Friedrich Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and many other great German philosophers. German philosophical thinking has a tendency for fatalism, the kind of heavy abstract thoughts carrying the world's weight on their shoulders, and the tendency to continuously, relentlessly pursue ideas to their endpoint, wherever that might lead. There is a term for this in German, Drang nach dem Absoluten, so the drive towards the absolute. This tendency is, for example, hard to find in Anglophone philosophy, which tends to be much more practical and engaging with the real, material world. Many suggest that this tendency has its roots in the specifics of the German Reformation. Martin Luther demanded radical desacralization of the church and rejected the division of priestly and secular matters common in the Middle Ages. Salvation was not to be provided by the church, but by individual pursuit of it. Religious fervor was to be applied in all aspects of life, especially in work. That might have led to the divinization of secular political life, where all the pursuits should be executed with similar enthusiasm that was previously dedicated to matters of religion, creating fertile ground for radical political ideologies to thrive. When we once again look at the 1933 German federal elections, the regions with the most Catholics were the ones where the Nazi Party was the least electorally successful in. Now, it is, of course, important not to paint this German fervor and uncompromising attitude purely in a negative light, since it also gave the world the thrive for universal literacy, so everyone can personally engage in the study of the Bible, and a massive amount of German technological innovations and cultural achievements. To us Czechs, as well as many other East Central European nations, many of the civilizational achievements of the Western civilization came through Germany. And the world has often looked at the region through Germany, which is why the names for many capitals of the region in most Western languages are derived from their German names, like Prague or Warsaw, and not the Slavic ones, Praha and Warsaw. Emanuel Todt argues that the traditional peasant family type in Germany was the stem family, characterized by patrilineal primogeniture and parental authority. It means that the oldest son and his family continued to live with the parents under the father's authority until the father dies. Then, the oldest son inherits everything. The younger sons must find their own fortune in the world, and daughters marry away. This family type gives societies a tendency for authoritarianism and unegalitarianism, since people were exposed for centuries to paternal authority and the unequal position of the siblings. Societies with this family type display extraordinary levels of economic dynamism and technological prowess, since they are orderly, disciplined, and have a sense of hierarchy and authority. The patrilineal unequal inheritance incentivizes the continuity of know-how and economic enterprises passed on from generation to generation. However, the stem family type can also create certain rigidity and paralysis stemming from the lack of flexibility and openness, since there is a high emphasis on the continuity of doing things in the same way they were always done, with an opposition towards the constant change demanded by the creative destruction of modern capitalism. As you will see later in this video, the traditional family type of Germany also impacts the low fertility of Germany in the current day and age. So, with this historical and anthropological window into Germany out of the way, let's get into demographics. Otto von Bismarck said that Germany was built on blood and iron. To be even more accurate, he could add very high birth rates, even though it wouldn't sound as cool. A common pattern in world history in the past 250 years is that when a country enters the rapid growth phase of the demographic transition at a similar time when it starts massively industrializing, it is a recipe for greatness. The process started on the British Isles in the second half of the 18th century and then gradually spread throughout Europe and the world. Germany entered the rapid growth phase in the 1800s, when there was no united German state, and Germany was just an ethno-geographic area comprising many states, dukedoms, and principalities. Germany was seen more as a land of thinkers, poets, and fairy tale romanticist medieval castles than a land of iron, steel, and blazing industrial furnaces. That was about to change. France has been traditionally by far the most populous country in Western Europe. During the reign of Napoleon, there were 10% more French than Germans. In 1913, there were 40% more Germans than the French. That was caused not only by Germany's rapid growth, but also by the fact that France did not really go through the rapid growth of the demographic transition, being a prominent exception to the rule. Nevertheless, Germany experienced massive population growth, from 23 million in 1800 to 40 million in 1870 and 67 million in 1913, while rapidly industrializing and politically unifying. Juggernaut has entered the stage of European geopolitics. Between 1870 and 1913, German manufacturing went from a third of the British one to overtaking it. On the eve of the First World War, Germany was a vibrant nation full of youthful energy with a population pyramid looking like an actual pyramid. Their population of men in the primary military age of 20 to 34 was more than 3 million higher than that of France. It was by far the most populous country in Europe, with Russia being the prominent exception. The fear of German demographic expansion was a common feature of the public debate in France and Britain at the time. Back then, it was common for journalists to routinely compare the birth rates and military age male populations of competing European countries. The Daily Mail lamented in 1903 that the decline in the British birth rate is beginning to menace the predominance of our race. A French work entitled The Expansion of Germany, published on the eve of the war, worried that fertility is a permanent feature of the German race, and the growth of this population assures Germany a parallel growth in its military power. Today, the debate could look like this. We have 0.2 children per woman more than you. If we annually import 300,000 people from the third world, our pension system will collapse at least 7 years later than yours. Eat it. Back then it was, our women have 5 children on average, while yours only 3.5. We will decimate you on the battlefield, you frog-eating degenerates. What a time, guys, right? It is funny that the Germans feared exactly the same thing from the Slavs on their eastern borders, which entered their demographic transition even later. The influential German historian Friedrich Meinke pointed out that almost the entire Slavic race points to an inexhaustible fertility. I wish you were right, Friedrich. German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg expressed concern about the Russian population that grows and lies on us like a never heavier nightmare. These calculations decisively contributed to Germany's now or never gamble that led to the war. People living in the high growth phase of the demographic transition did not know that they were living in such an age, and they just presumed the current population growth would continue indefinitely. Hungary-born historian Emil Reich predicted in 1907 that by 2000 Germany would have 200 million people, causing disturbance among the British and French thinkers of the time. Maybe we can take some comfort in this, since our current bleak predictions of our demographic future can be as wrong as theirs at the time, even though it does not seem like it. Germany was characterized by a very significant difference in fertility between the urban and rural populations, higher than in Britain, for example. While the fertility between the German unification in 1870 and the First World War was still very high, it was pulled up by the very high fertility of the still predominant rural population. Between 1871 and 1910, the rural population of the German Empire declined from 64 to 40%, while the population of cities larger than 100,000 rose from 5 to 21%. This fact was then later reflected in the Nazi ideology fetishism of pure rural life, unspoiled by the material decadence of low fertility cities. However, as urbanization proceeded, the lowering of fertility on the national level was unstoppable. Other patterns were the emerging divide between the higher fertility of the poorer and less educated versus the lower fertility of the richer educated classes. While this seems like a natural reality for us today, back then it was a relatively new thing, since in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution, the wealthier classes reproduced more than the poor, likely because they just had more resources to keep their children alive. This development was very unnerving for people at the time, since social Darwinism and a tendency towards eugenics were broadly accepted. German elites feared the genetic decline of the national health and morals. Another important cleavage influencing German fertility at the time was the divide between Protestants and Catholics, with Catholics being more fertile than Protestants. That also falls within the broader trends, since Catholics had, on average, significantly higher fertility than Protestants throughout the West until the end of the 20th century, when the tide turned. Today, historically Protestant countries are notably more fertile than the historically Protestant countries. All the dreams of 200 million strong German nation dominating the European continent died in the trenches of the First World War. Not only did 2 million German soldiers die on the battlefield, often the elite of the nation, but the fertility rate plunged to sub-replacement levels. While it somewhat recovered after the war, it never went over 3 children per woman again, and it went sub-replacement once again during the Great Depression years. It would happen anyway, since the demographic transition proceeded even in countries almost unaffected by the war. Still, it would likely be much more gradual without the rupture of the war. During the interwar period, it became clear that all the notions of intrinsic German tendency for high fertility were wrong. Germany also lost territory with about 7 million people, even though by far not all of them were ethnic Germans. I have already talked about the tendency of the German mind to get lost in abstract ideological depths and pursue ideological goals with religious fervor. The worst example of this tendency was about to come. Just as it was becoming clear that the demographic might of the German nation wouldn't grow indefinitely, and that Germany wouldn't demographically dominate the European East and the fertile lands of Ukraine, Germany fell for what is probably the most radical, demographically charged ideology in the history of Europe and likely the world. I mean, we all know what Nazism was, and how it all went down, so I won't spend much time describing it. Hitler dreamed of subjugating Eastern Europe, getting rid of the native populations and repopulating it with German Herrenvolk. In the series of transcribed Hitler's monologues called Hitler's Table Talk, one can see that he was inspired a lot by the American subjugation of the North American continent. Slavs inhabiting the region were thus seen as akin to American Indians, a primitive people that would make Lebensraum for the superior German race. But, as we all know, the Katyusha rockets falling upon Berlin reminded the Germans that Slavs were not Apaches, even though they were Comanches. It shows the level of delusion that Hitler suffered, since to truly believe in the Americans versus Indians analogy, he had to be either misled to believe that inhabitants of Eastern Europe were tribal people without immunity to German diseases that had never invented the wheel, or he had truly believed that Germans were superhumans. While the German war machinery was indisputably a mighty force to reckon with, the war against Britain, America, and the Soviet Union simultaneously was obviously, and fortunately, a lost cause. And there was, of course, the Holocaust, one of the most horrendous crimes in the history of humanity, where German precision was applied to the industrial murder of a whole ethno-religious group. Many historians or other intellectuals claim that Nazism could happen anywhere in Western Europe, that we are all capable of such evil deeds, and that it was just a combination of historical coincidences that it happened in Germany. I disagree with this interpretation. While it obviously is true that all humans are capable of incredible evil, there was something deeply German about it. I could never have imagined it happening in Britain, for example. The British were always too grounded in reality to fall for such a madman as Hitler. Italian fascism never even came close to the level of murderous grandiosity of Nazism. Italy is too Catholic and laid back. But the German propensity towards obeying authority, egalitarianism, discipline, and the propensity for grand and abstract ideas fused in the worst possible way. Czech writer and journalist Jiří Peňáz told a story about his grandfather, who was a relatively open anti-Semite, in a way that was not really that uncommon in the early 20th century Europe. He told his grandson, quote, "You know, when I visited German cities, and all the shops on the main streets were owned by the Jews, I always knew it would not do any good, that it would end up badly. But then again, the Germans always overdo it." Yep, somewhat of an understatement. The demographic impacts of the Second World War were enormous, and almost the exact opposite of what the Nazis had planned. Instead of German ethnic domination of Eastern Europe, the 1,000-year-old German ethnic penetration of the region ended. Between 12 and 16 million Germans either fled or were expelled from Eastern Europe. Königsberg turned into Kaliningrad, Danzig into Gdańsk, and Breslau into Wrocław. Regions that were core parts of Prussia for centuries became parts of the Polish state, and Germany was divided between capitalist West Germany and communist East Germany. Another chapter in the long history of the Germania Slavica ethnic frontier has begun. Between 7 and 9 million Germans have died. But while Germans failed in their delusional bloody dreams of dominating Eastern Europe, the region has paid the highest price. 20 to 27 million inhabitants of the Soviet Union died, most notably Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Jews. 6 million inhabitants of Poland, about half of them Jews. Between 1 and 2 million inhabitants of Yugoslavia, 5 to 800,000 Greeks, around 300,000 Czechs and Czechoslovak Jews. One cannot shake off the suspicion that the history of Europe could have been much more pleasant if Germany had never unified. After the Second World War, both West and East Germany, together with the rest of the Western world, experienced 2 decades of baby boom. Even though the fertility rates were relatively high, the baby boom was less pronounced than in other Western countries, with the fertility rate barely going over 2.5 children per woman. Interestingly, the development of fertility rates was similar on both sides of the Cold War demarcation line, even though the people lived in dramatically different regimes. In 1970, the fertility rate went sub-replacement, and the fertility in West Germany soon became one of the lowest in the world. It was somewhat higher in the east, but still under 2.1 children per woman. In 1972, the German nation entered a natural demographic decline that has not stopped for even a year since then. Not even a lifetime after many people contemplated the possibility of 200 million strong German nation, German ethnicity started to die out. Today, there are many countries with fertility rates close to that of Germany, but having a fertility rate of around 1.4 children per woman in the 1970s was uniquely low. Now, there are many theories of why that is the case. The most sensible one I have read is the one proposed by Emmanuel Todd. Certain countries possess what he calls a tradition of anthropological feminism. Anthropological feminist countries were those where women had traditionally more equal positions in relation to men. Now, they were obviously not equal, God forbid. It was not feminism as we understand it. But they stopped being illiterate not long after men and could, for example, sign contracts. Countries with anthropological feminist tradition include the Anglophone countries, France, Scandinavia, or the Benelux countries. These countries usually have somewhat higher fertility in the context of the developed world, since they integrated the 1960s female emancipation wave, what we perceive as feminism, relatively smoothly, without complete fertility disruption. It is quite normal to have a kid while studying or working and coming to work on some part-time contract 3 months after giving birth. Fertility in these countries is usually somewhat closer to 2 children per woman than to 1 child per woman. Countries without this historical tradition include German-speaking Europe, most of East Asia, or Italy. In these countries, the arrival of female emancipation from the 1960s on created a paralysis of family life, since the deeply psychologically rooted position of motherhood as the primary role of a woman and somewhat of a full-time job for her did not rub well with women pursuing higher education and careers in similar numbers as men. Thus, in these countries, there is very low fertility and a high number of childless women, since women often choose between motherhood and career. It might not be a perfect explanation, but it is likely the best one I have found, since otherwise it is relatively hard to find out why fertility rates in German-speaking countries, not just Germany, but also Switzerland and Austria, are consistently lower than in France or the UK. The Czech Republic is also a country without this tradition of equality of the sexes. While we managed to have relatively high fertility in the past decade, our family policy is very much oriented towards mothers staying home for a long time with the baby. And even though the media and business people are always pushing the narrative that this should be changed and we should implement the quick return to work after giving birth model, most women still prefer to stay with their children for a longer period of time. So, Germany has been losing population by natural decline for more than 50 years. Relatively early after the Second World War, immigration became a permanent feature of German demographic reality. Obviously, mostly the West German one. Many Germans came from Eastern Europe after the Second World War. Another ethnically German stream of immigration came in the 1980s, when the remaining ethnic Germans from the USSR and other Eastern Bloc countries were allowed to return to Germany. and it is estimated that up to 2007, almost 5 million ethnic Germans were repatriated in this way. In the 1950s and 1960s, Gastarbeiter, or guest worker programs, were implemented, designed to temporarily bring in foreign workers to help worker shortages in economies being rebuilt after the war. Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Yugoslavia, Morocco, Tunisia and Turkey were among the first wave of countries that signed these agreements with Germany. Turkey pressured West Germany to admit its citizens as guest workers. Theodor Blank, Secretary of State for Employment, opposed such agreements. He held the opinion that the cultural gap between Germany and Turkey would be too large, and also held the opinion that Germany didn't need any more laborers, because enough unemployed people were living in the poorer regions of Germany who could fill these vacancies. The United States, however, put some political pressure on Germany, wanting to stabilize and create goodwill from a potential ally. West Germany and Turkey reached an agreement in 1961. After that, Turkish citizens, largely from the rural areas, soon became the largest group of guest workers in West Germany. The expectation at the time on the part of both the West German and Turkish governments was that working in Germany would be only temporary. Some migrants did return after having built up savings for their return, but most did not. The recruitment treaty was changed in 1964, so Turkish guest workers could stay longer. In the 1980s, the ex-chancellor Helmut Kohl had plans to halve the Turkish population in Germany, but they did not become reality. From the 1980s on, the German government started to accept war and political refugees, for example from Iran or Turkish Kurds. Hundreds of thousands of people came from Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Millions of European work migrants flowed into Germany, especially from the post-communist EU countries and Southern Europe, especially after the 2009 financial crisis. And in 2015, the European migrant crisis took place when 1.1 million people arrived in Germany in a single year. Since 2022, a massive wave of refugees from Ukraine came into Germany, and in 2023, another wave of immigration from the Middle East, Africa, Afghanistan and so is culminating. So, let's get to the juicy topic of immigration and ethnic change. Today, ethnic Germans without immigration background comprise around 71% of the German population, and that number is declining rapidly. In 2010, they comprised 82% of the population. It is perfectly reasonable to expect that in 2030s it will be close to 60%. We must apply a certain amount of nuance when interpreting this data. A German without an immigration background is a person with both parents of fully or mostly German ancestry. If a German citizen marries and has children with a Dutch or a Dane, the offsprings are counted as people with an immigration background. There is also the question of Germans from the ex-Eastern Bloc countries coming from the 1980s, who are also counted as having an immigration background. While these people were ethnic Germans, their integration wasn't as natural as it might seem at first sight. Many of the Russians from the Soviet Union were very assimilated into the majority Russian culture, and Russian, not German, was their first language. But overall, their integration definitely isn't the most painful migration-related issue in Germany at the moment. Around 9% of the German population are from other EU member states, most notably Poles, Romanians and Italians. Another 8% are so-called other Europeans, meaning Europe without the EU. But there is a catch there, since Turks, the most numerous minority in Germany, are included in the European category. That is controversial, to say the least. I know that Turkey is a grey zone in terms of its Europeanness, and in the end, it is a lot about which Turks are coming. Are they Turkish liberals from Istanbul? The integration would likely be without that many issues. But as was said in the previous chapter, they were mostly rural Turks, which is a completely different story. The debate on immigration is very complex, since not only the country of origin, but also the social strata from which the people come within the country is crucial. The second most numerous immigrant group in the Czech Republic are Slovaks, predominantly young college students and skilled workers. It would be a completely different story if it were predominantly rural gypsies from eastern Slovakia. When one debates immigration with people who are more prone to pro-immigration views, Iranian communities are often brought up as an example of very well integrated Muslim community. However, the Iranian communities in Western Europe were created by the emigration of, in the Iranian context, secular, liberal, educated, Tehran-based people fleeing from the Ayatollah regime. They will naturally not be pushing for the Islamization of Sweden or Germany if their parents ran away from the Islamization of Iran. So, if we move Turks from the other European category to Asia category, the Asia origin population of Germany would swell from 7 to 10%. In comparison, the other European would decline from 8 to 5%. It is also important to note that this estimation of the population of Turkish origin is very conservative, about 3 million, and other sources put it closer to 7 million people. From Asia, the most numerous are people from Kazakhstan, probably mostly the Germans previously living in Soviet Kazakhstan. Apart from that, Syrians, Afghans and Iraqis are the most populous groups. Around 1.5% of the German population is of African origin. Now, as in other countries with heavy immigration, the age and the geographic distribution of the migrant population are crucial. In 2019, the average age of Germans without an immigration background was 47.3 years, while the average age of Germans with at least one parent born abroad was 35.6 years. That is a hell of a difference. 41% of people under 15 have at least one parent born abroad. Also, almost 90% of the people with an immigration background are concentrated in the ex-Western German federal republics, and they are also disproportionately urban, living in the largest urban areas like Frankfurt, Cologne, Hamburg or Stuttgart, in which people of immigration background often have a majority. When you travel across contemporary Germany, the large urban areas and small towns and rural areas are completely different demographic realities. Emmanuel Todt claims that Germany has made massive immigration one of the core aspects of its foreign economic policy, which seems to be the case. In 1971, the last year before the German population started to decline naturally, the combined population of East and West Germany was over 78 million. Back then, even though some guest workers were already present, it was overwhelmingly ethnic Germans, about 95%. So, the population of Germans without immigration background was circa 75 million. Today, there are 59 million Germans without immigration background in Germany, and the number is declining by hundreds of thousands yearly. So, in the 50 years of natural decline, around 15 million Germans have just died out. But, at the same time, the population of Germany has grown to over 84 million people. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people, the vast majority of them ethnic Germans, die, and they are replaced by immigrants. That is not some great replacement theory, that is just math. No other country in the world is combining the same level of demographic decline with the adamant determination to balance its natural decline by immigration. Other countries with very high immigration levels but higher native birth rates have experienced large population growth, for example France, the UK or Canada. The German population has been remarkably stable in the past 50 years, around 80 million. But that is only an illusion hiding massive inner changes. And the ethnic change is just gathering pace. The most populous generations of Germans born in the 1950 to 1970 period are slowly but surely aging. People born in 1950 are 73 years old today. The average life expectancy in Germany is over 80. Germany has so far behaved like a sponge, sucking up labor from the poorer parts of Europe. Millions of Eastern and Southern Europeans live and work in Germany. So far, so good. Migrants from Europe will integrate. Many of their descendants now likely see themselves more as German than as Poles or Greeks. While every immigration creates certain issues, there is a relatively simple key to assess how certain groups integrate after they immigrate, and that is their family type. Emmanuel Todt points out that in most of the Muslim world, there is an endogamous communitarian family, which basically means a clan family structure with high levels of cousin marriages. Families in societies with this family type create vast family structures full of more or less distant cousins, often in high tens or even hundreds of people. Joseph Henrich, in his book The Weirdest People in the World, pointed out that the early Catholic Church crusade against clan families and cousin marriages was one of the founding stones of the modern West, since it highly empowered individualism, voluntary association, and will to perceive oneself as separate from his clan family. In this sense, the cousin marriage-based clan family is the most distant from Western countries, since it has baked in its essence anti-individualism and the self-identification of one with his extended family before anything else. People from Western countries perceive lying to court to cover for a cousin who committed a hit and run as highly immoral. In contrast, people from countries with high levels of cousin marriages deem giving out your cousin as immoral. How could you prefer some impersonal state justice system before your own blood? Interpersonal trust is also much higher in countries without clan families, since people are anthropologically used to trusting people beyond their extended family. An interesting fact is that Sicily is the place in Europe where first cousin marriages were practiced most extensively and for the longest period of time. And it is also the place where enduring family-based clan-like mafia structures were created. While anywhere in Europe, first cousin marriages are basically non-existent and it is somewhat of a cultural taboo, in Turkey, the cousin marriage rate is around 15%, being especially high in the north and east of the country. While in the Arab Middle East, the rate goes to 35%, and in Afghanistan, it is close to 50%. It is no coincidence that communities from these places will be the ones that will be hardest to integrate. Now, as usual, I am speaking on the population level. Individually, many people are obviously perfectly integrated. But on the population level, they tend to have very low levels of marrying out of their ethnic groups, which is logical if the modus operandi in your home country was to not even marry out of your clan. In comparison, the immigrants from Eastern Europe and the Balkans show high levels of intermarriage. A study examining marriage patterns of immigrants to Germany from the 1984 to 2002 period shows that while 22% of male and 28% of female immigrants from ex-Yugoslavia married a native German, the rates for Turks was 6.7% for males and 1.8% for females. German elites have relentlessly pursued the immigration foreign policy based on importing vast numbers of people to counter the demographic decline, but they have made a classic liberal mistake of thinking of people as interchangeable economic units, sort of homo economicus, without deep cultural roots. So, there are two levels of debates to be had about German immigration and demographic development. One is the massive work-based immigration of Europeans into Germany, today most notably of Eastern Europeans and, to a smaller degree, Southern Europeans. More than 1 million Ukrainian refugees settled in Germany in the last 2 years. That won't be without impacts. The ethnocultural fabric of Germany will inevitably change. Ethnic homogeneity is already lost in Germany, and this process will only intensify due to the dying out of all the generations of ethnic Germans. But, as the intermarriage rate of people from Yugoslavia suggests, the integration will happen. Hitler wanted to purge the Slavic Untermensch out of Eastern Europe. Well, Adolf, I hate to break it to you, but Germany will be somewhat of a Slavic country in the 21st century. The second level is immigration from Turkey, the broader Muslim world, and Africa, often based on people claiming asylum instead of directly looking for work. Here, the emerging picture is very different. 8 years after the Great Migration Crisis of 2015, I think it is not too bold to conclude that it was a mistake, and the Germans are starting to realize it. As a self-appointed representative of the Visegrad countries, I will say it. We told you so. Germans once again believed their illusions, that they could mitigate their demographic deficiencies while also finally proving to themselves that they are a country where people are finding refuge from persecution and not one from which they flee. Like other illusions for which Germans have fallen in the past, this is also a dangerous one. It is fascinating how much history is happening all around us in the current day. One of the most impactful consequences of the Israel-Hamas war in Europe is the dramatic change of atmosphere in regard to the Muslim diaspora in Europe. We truly live in a globalized world. For so long were Germans reminded of their Nazi past in relation to the integration of immigrants that they arrived at a point of mass displays of antisemitism on their streets. And the migration is not slowing down. This year, most asylum claimants since the migration crisis will arrive in Germany, mostly from Syria, Afghanistan, Turkey or Iraq, and as usual, mostly young and male. Lots of displays of successful integration are to be seen on the German streets. At an anti-Israeli demonstration in Düsseldorf, one of the speakers demanded that the mayor of the city change the narrative regarding the conflict in Israel, backing his demand by claiming that a third of the children in Düsseldorf is ours. In a friendly football match between Turkey and Germany in Berlin, in which the Turkish team won 3-2, the Turkish team had overwhelming support from the fans in the stadium. You have to say that we had an away match in the capital, said the German footballer Niklas Füllkrug. Most of the Turkish fans were Berlin residents, not visitors from Turkey. As I am writing this video, the German federal police officer informed the public that mass immigration is fueling a surge in violent crime. All this is happening in the backdrop of an economic crisis in Germany, whose consequences are hard to estimate, but it will likely be significant. The specter of the industrialization haunts the country. Alternative for Deutschland has over 20% in the polls and 30% in the ex-Eastern German federal republics. Things are going to get interesting in Germany. As for the future, Germany is a wild card for me. Some things are certain. Unless the fertility of ethnic Germans rises massively, Germany will continue to be less ethnically German and more diverse. The demographic cards are already dealt in this regard. If German elites stay committed to its policy of balancing the natural declines with immigration, this process will be very fast. If not, Germany will stay more ethnically German longer, but its median age will go over 50 very fast, and the overall population will start collapsing instead of stagnating or growing modestly. I think we might be surprised at how tough Germany might get on immigration and the problems stemming from poorly integrated migrants in the near future. Out of all the European countries with issues arising from unmanaged immigration, I think Germany has the highest chance of a brutal, state-facilitated approach towards it. Germany is a country that will likely face a massive economic, political and social crisis. Its workforce is massively aging and its industry is rapidly losing competitiveness. As was said previously in the video, societies with the German family type are capable of massive economic dynamism, but they can also be relatively rigid and inflexible in their ways. The latter is catching up with the German economy right now. The previously functioning economic model based on cheap Russian gas and top-notch German engineering seems exhausted. Without the Russian gas flowing, the future looks bleak in a world of cloud, digital economy and AI, technologies in which Germany is far behind the competitors. In combination with the demographic reality described in the previous chapters, it is an explosive cocktail. It is one thing to be accepting of foreigners when your economy is working like a clock, and a different one when things are going down the drain. And the behavior of the migrants might also become much more radical if the social benefits are significantly cut down. In this atmosphere, the German propensity for extremes might once again start to show, and Germany might start deporting and locking people up with similar zeal with which it was previously silencing those voicing their concerns about it. When you look at the conduct of Germany, there is a profound lack of moderation. Do we want to help those in need to feel better about ourselves in the light of our history? How about a few million people about whom we know almost nothing, coming from completely alien cultures within a couple of years? Just to start. We should probably lower our emissions, and there was a tsunami in Japan? Fair enough. Just shut all of the nuclear plants off, every one of them. Oh, now we are deporting people? Alright, let's go. On the other hand, it is tough to predict if the German behavioral archetypes applicable in the past will still be relevant in the future, when the German youth will be only partially German and partially kind of pan-European mix combined with Middle Eastern elements. The existing juxtaposition of predominantly ethnically German East, without Berlin, rural areas and small towns, next to hyperdiverse metropolitan regions with growing distrust between the two, will only reinforce. There is an interesting parallel between Germany and Japan in the post-World War II history. Two previously highly militant expanding powers that lost the World War, then once again became economic powerhouses, and their fertility collapsed. They are now the two oldest countries in the world in regards to median age. While Japan chose the strategy of ethnic continuity and population decline, Germany sacrificed ethnic continuity in exchange for a higher demographic and economic dynamism. Watching how the countries fare in the 21st century will be highly interesting. From the point of view of people living on the other side of the Germania-Slavica border, the story goes on as usual. We are standing and watching what Germany will do, since we have to prepare for the consequences.